When the Lord called us to come to Ireland and we began to plan and to prepare, there were many, there was much warfare, I would say. And when we gathered as a team, I remember Maggie was sharing some of that earlier. When we gathered as a team and said, you know what, we need to fast together and pray together. And so for 21 days, we began to fast and pray. On the very first day, the Lord began to show me a principality in this region. And it was a dragon, it looked like a snake dragon. That's the best way to explain it. And he was in the waters. And he kept saying, nothing in, nothing out. It was a chant he was making, nothing in, nothing out. And so this principality has almost as though he has set himself that there are people that the Lord is supposed to usher into this nation to bring help. But then it has been keeping it bound. And then there are people that are supposed to be exported from this nation as missionaries, as evangelists, as apostles. There is a sound that is supposed to come out of this nation. And that principality said, nothing in, nothing out. So then we began to pray, because now we see it and we can have more precision in prayer. And as we began to pray, nothing was working. Nothing was working. Day after day, the same principality will chant, nothing in, nothing out. And then there was a day in particular, as we were praying, we saw almost like mini bombs hitting this thing over and over. And what was so fascinating, Maggie had actually shared with us that there is a tourist attraction in Dublin. And it's a gate and a dragon-looking creature on the gate. And the thing is that principalities, they like to make themselves known in the culture. You may call it entertainment, but they call it taking territory. They want their images reflected. I live in California, and in LA, Los Angeles to be precise. In Los Angeles, especially in the film industry, you will see a lot of demonic representations. And you may think it's entertainment, and it's not. These are principalities and powers making their image known through media. I remember watching the movie Apostle, and the demon in that movie, the imagery of that demon is a demon I had seen in real life. So the imagery was, the intelligence of that makeup was given to that person. It was not just someone being creative to say, oh, why doesn't this thing look like this? And then I said, this is demonic intelligence at play. And so even in Dublin, the very thing that is keeping the gates of the city, the gates of the nation bound, is what people go to take pictures in front of. The imagery of it. And so we began to pray, we continued to intercede. And a particular day, the Lord now shows up, I have opened up the nation to you. And that was when, that moment, our team is here, they can tell you this, that was when everything began to turn around. We still saw the principality, but we knew that it was defeated before the purposes and the will of God. But how did we get to that point? Intercession. It wasn't going to shift until we came together in prayer. You see, there is a need for intercessors in this land. There's been a lot of prayer going forth today, but that should be and prayer is not just what we do in the place of our communion and our declaration and the place of our posture with the Lord. It's what we do as we act. So when the prophet Elijah began to intercede for rain, he's interceding while calling his servant, what do you see? So there is a both and, there is an action taking place, but we intercede because we must first win the battle in the place of the spirit realm. And then we must keep watch in the natural realm to know how to move. If you only do one or the other, it becomes ineffective. Because if all Elijah did was to just be on the mountain with his head bowed down, then there's an action he must take that will continue to echo what the Lord was doing. And so we're going to have this conversation today about the rise of the intercessors. Because there is major warfare at the gates of this nation. There are many people that will just say, oh, that's for somebody else. Right? They feel called in different ways. But I want us to even talk about why this is so critical. Because you see, the Lord, there's certain things that the Lord did not say if you do it, right? But when. Prayer and fasting are one of those things. And one of the things I began to learn, even about the way the kingdom of darkness operates, is that it's very self-focused, right? And so when you go back to Cain and Abel, after what Cain did to his brother, the Lord says, ask him, where is your brother? And he says, am I my brother's keeper? And it would be a sad thing for us as believers to have this self-focus, because intercession goes beyond you. Intercession is not about you praying for 21 days just for your marriage. Intercession goes beyond you. It's when you begin to pray for your nation, when the Lord puts a burden on you to pray for your pastors, when the Lord puts a burden on you to pray for your leaders, when the Lord puts a burden on you to pray for the souls of men in the territory. And for the average person, it's like, why? Why do I need to do this? And I began to understand that as long as a nation is in bondage, the people are in bondage. They just don't know it. Because there are certain things that cannot open for you in the land while it is in bondage. There are certain things that cannot open up for your children in the land while it is in bondage. And many people begin to live a counterfeit life from what the Lord ordained out of them. And just because you can pay bills, just because you can go home to a family, does not mean that you are in the will of the Lord. And so, Apostle, I want us to talk about why this must be a burden that all believers rise up and say, let me put my quota in. That in my household there must be an altar of prayer for my nation, and not just seeing it as that is someone else's thing. Because trust me, when the Lord is saying go to Ireland, we were, even when it came down to what it will cost us, we were willing to pay anything, not because we have this abundance of resources, but we trust in the one who does, and we know that everything we have belongs to him. And if he will call us to this nation, there is something in it that is also connected to the things he's called us to do. Whenever the Lord puts a burden in your heart for something, whenever the Lord is awakening you to a reality, it's something about you he's also awakening. When a believer stands as an intercessor, there's something in the spiritual realm that you have matured into, not just remaining as a babe. You know, it's unfortunate sometimes that in the kingdom of darkness, they are more organized, yet we are the ones with the authority. We are the ones with the power. But because they are more organized, it seems as though they have more the ability to advance more than the kingdom of light. But if we begin to understand, just back to your point about the origin of our identity, then we will not succumb to just making the gospel about our needs. And I believe that's why Jesus, when he would even talk about seek first the kingdom, and the things that he would put as don't even worry about these things were needs. What you will eat, what you will drink, these are the things you need. And Jesus says, don't worry about these things. Don't minimize the gospel to your needs. It's bigger than that. I can supply that for you. Don't minimize it to that level. But this is so critical. You know, I would even give an example just so that we even understand how things become normalized. You know, even when you talked about just how we, graduate, it begins as a drift, just a subtle drift, and then it becomes a way of the land. Right? When you look at the letters that were written to the different churches in the book of Revelation, there was a church when the Lord began to judge, they tolerate Jezebel, right? Who calls herself a prophetess. And if you study that church, they were the loving church. They just loved everybody. They were inclusive, and it was that inclusivity where they lost their discernment to understand that you are actually, in all your inclusivity, you have given Jezebel a microphone. You have given Jezebel the ability to bring false doctrine to the people. Because when you read about what was said about the church, they were very loving. But then love is not just about a feeling. Love is not just about how culture sets it. Love is a person. And if it goes away the standards of God and the ways of God, it is not love. I remember, especially in the rise of LGBTQ, and you might be in the room and you just felt tight. I just said that and something made you feel little tight. But just listen, just go with me, because at the end of the day, trust me, you don't want to be a Christian who is called to live in freedom, yet you are bound because you have made your sexuality an idol. I remember when I was asking the Lord, Apostle, to teach me, I said, Lord, what is this spirit? Can you teach me about it? Why is it becoming such a norm in society? And for a couple of days, the Lord began to educate me about how this spirit operates. And very briefly, I'll just share, one of the ways that he began to show me was, first of all, it is a spirit of lust. But lust in the spirit realm has two genders. And so wherever it can, find expression, it would. So, there was a time where we only thought that people become that way due to sexual assault or sexual abuse by same sex, right? And then they start to have these feelings and tendencies. But that was not the only way. So the Lord began to show me that it has both genders, and any opportunity it has, it will take it. Right? So yes, can it happen through abuse? Absolutely. And then the Lord also began to show me that when parents, when a young man, a young woman is giving to pornography, especially in the case of a man, right? A man might be watching pornography, and what he's watching, he doesn't identify as that, but he's watching an expression of that. Some of you are tracking with me, right? What he's watching is two women. He doesn't identify to be homosexual, but he's entertaining the spirit behind it. So he opens a door. The enemy has legal rights because he has opened a door in his life that door does not, it may never manifest in his life, but it goes after his seed. So now when he has children, it is invited to the children. So you have children being born saying, well, this is just how I am. But if you trace it, the door opens somewhere in the bloodline. The other part of it is that when it becomes a law, when it becomes a norm, especially always be careful of what becomes law in society, because it gives those spirits legal grounds in the land. And if you don't speak against it, if you want to be so inclusive that you remove God and you remove the works and the word of Jesus from you are declaring, you also invite it into your household. You see, when the spirit of death was going to go through the land in the time of the Israelites in Egypt, the spirit of death was not, there were sometimes that, where there was darkness over the land, and it would be said in Goshen, there was light. But when the spirit of death was going after the firstborn male children in the family, Goshen was not separated from that, but an instruction was given to separate them. So if the Israelites chose to say, we're not going to follow the instruction, we don't have to put any blood on the threshold. No, we don't need to do that. That spirit will enter that house. Because the spirit did not know, oh, this house belongs to an Israelite. The spirit responded to the instruction that was given. And in the same way, when something becomes a law in the land, if you don't begin to speak against it in prayer, or in moments of conversation, you just say, well, everyone should love how they love, it has an invitation to your children. Because you never rejected it. And one of the things that the spirit realm is very good for is record keeping. It says, well, on this day, you did not reject. Exactly. And so I'm using that as an example to understand how organized this is. There are things that you cannot just sit back and watch play out. That we must know how to step into our position and know how to speak about certain things. I met a Muslim man on my way here. And I began to speak to him. I said, why are you Muslim? No, sometimes it's a question. And you know what he said to me? Oh, I grew up in a Muslim home. I said, so have you had any encounter with what you believe? Why is it a conviction for you? He didn't have anything to say. He just said, well, I grew up in a Muslim home and I believe everything leads to God. And many times we want to pause in that moment and say, well, I just respect all beliefs. You can respect all people, but not all beliefs. If you respect all beliefs, then you don't understand the foundation of our faith. And I said to the man, I said, I can understand you being Muslim because you were born into it. But what if your parents were wrong? I said, I'm Christian. You didn't ask me, but I will tell you how I became Christian. And I saw that there was something happening in him, almost like a fight for anger or curiosity. You could see it in his eyes, where it's like, should I be angry that she's telling me my God is not God? But there was also this curiosity that he had, but what if something is off? Because I said, everything cannot point to the same God. It's not possible. But going back to what you said, Apostle, so we shift from that, and you said something so key about healing, that we must first heal. And the moment you said that, it's like the Lord just opened my eyes, and I began to see, just even throughout the room, there are many people that have this garment of shame and unworthiness. There was a conversation we had, last year about the soul. And the soul is the place of contention, because the soul is the seat of your identity. A lot of trauma that people experience in life, it's not just because that it's to experience it and overcome it, right? Like, okay, let me just find how to cope with it and all of that. We go to therapy, and I think therapy is wonderful, but therapy has a place. It's not in the first order of business, because therapy can only manage the identity you present. Therapy cannot restore your original identity in God. And so we see how the enemy, a lot of the things we experience in life, the trauma we experience in life, the rejection we experience in life, the feeling of unworthiness, it's actually an attack against identity. Because you cannot carry beyond what you believe, beyond the belief of who you are.